Are some people just born wanting to be violent to others and dominate others? Or is that just a result of, say, a bad childhood or poor education? If the latter is true, then crime can be solved fundamentally by better education and better social programs. If the former is true, then we'll never be able to get rid of the cops and prisons and the kind of cruder ways of dealing with criminals. I'm Coleman Hughes, and today we're talking about one of my favorite books, A Conflict of Visions by Thomas Sowell. This book was pretty important to me when I was an undergrad because it sought to explain one of the most important questions I was thinking about then, and one of the questions you should all be thinking about now. He begins the book by asking this question: why is it that people predictably line up on different sides of issues that seem very unrelated? So if you ask someone on the street, like, hey, what do you think of gun control? They would say, oh, I think this. And then, hey, what do you think of affirmative action? Oh, I think this. Hey, what do you think of minimum wage laws? I think this. You wouldn't expect that they should be all correlated and that you should get two lineups of people that all agree on a certain totally unrelated issue. Like, what does gun control have to do with climate change, right? But Sowell thinks that this is not a coincidence, and it's not just partisanship. In other words, it's not just the psychology of team sports. There's actually two different visions of the world, of how the world works, and in particular how human beings work, that underlie all of these seemingly more superficial disagreements. Now, he doesn't really say that they're the right and the left, but sometimes he kind of hints at that they're the right and the left. But let's just table that for now and not talk about the right and the left. He calls them the constrained vision and the unconstrained vision. What does this word constrained refer to? He's referring to human nature itself. Is human nature constrained, or is human nature unconstrained? What does that mean? Constrained in this context means changeable. Is human nature fundamentally always going to be what it is? Or is it possible for us to become radically better, radically more giving, radically less selfish, radically less short-sighted, radically more loving, more open-minded? Your opinion on whether human nature is constrained has very deep implications for what kind of political systems will work and what kind of political systems won't work. Another more simple way of labeling these, I think this comes from Steven Pinker's comment on Sowell, is the tragic vision and the utopian vision. The constrained vision of human nature is tragic because it says we can never actually perfect ourselves or improve ourselves, at least not as a whole species. And the utopian vision is just that. It's the vision that we can make a kind of heaven on earth by bettering ourselves, changing our societies, and so forth. Where does the rubber hit the road with these two visions, right? Well, one area would be, for instance, in crime. After 2020 and George Floyd and the riots and the protests, it was a very popular idea to replace police officers with social workers or skilled de-escalators, so that if something was going down between two people on a street, folks were scared, instead of calling the police, you would call these people that would come without guns and basically talk. A lot of people are into this idea because they felt, okay, well, if we train the social workers the right way, then they'll be able to talk down the people that are being violent in the right way, and everything will be much better. And they'll never have to resort to using their gun or even using a taser. And in fact, it's the presence of the gun and the presence of the cop and the provocation of the cop that actually makes a lot of these situations go sideways. If you just had someone come in gently, like a kindergarten school teacher with that soothing voice, actually a lot of these altercations wouldn't start to begin with. So that's a vision of human nature where people aren't just violent to be violent. People are violent because they're provoked, or because a cop has done something wrong, or a cop has brandished a gun. And actually, in the absence of that provocation, no one has an urge to be violent for violence sake. So if you just treat the situation differently, there's no reason for a crime to really occur. The tragic vision would say the opposite. It would say some people are just violent and you don't need to ask why. In fact, it may be baked into their nature. And so the way to prevent violence is simply to meet it with force, deterrent force, and warehousing force, in the sense of putting people behind bars. That's an area where your underlying assumptions about, for instance, why people commit crime come straight out of your assumptions about human nature itself. Are some people just born wanting to be violent to others and dominate others? Or is that just a result of, say, a bad childhood or poor education? If the latter is true, then crime can be solved fundamentally by better education and better social programs. If the former is true, then we'll never be able to get rid of the cops and prisons and the kind of cruder ways of dealing with criminals. At a larger level, the unconstrained and the constrained vision connect very deeply with economic systems, or systems of political economics. What am I talking about? I'm talking about capitalism and communism, right? If you think about it, the allure of communism is deep because all of us, if we're lucky, we grow up in a communist system, which is called a family. A family is the perfect example of what communism is and how communism actually can work, which is to say, from each according to his ability and to each according to his need. That's what communism says, right? All you have to do, just do the work that you're able to do, right? It doesn't matter how skilled you are or how unskilled you are. You can have no skills at all. Just do what you're able to do. And what you need, everything you need will be provided from the Commonwealth, right? That's what a family is. You know, if you're 5 years old and you can help mommy with the dishes or whatever, that's fine. That's all you need to do, because mommy and daddy are going to do the real work, bring in the real resources, and make sure everyone is fed and clothed and so forth. Perfect. Communism works perfectly at that level. And so it's very tempting to say, why can't we make all of society like one big family? What is actually the barrier to doing that? Can we raise people to think of, at minimum, members of their country, just like they would think of members of their family, and from each according to what he can do, to each according to his needs, right? If that were able to work, then communism could scale up to a whole society. But in order for that to work, you would have to be able to change the knobs of human psychology, which is to say, we have deep emotional and psychological attachments to our family members genetically and inherently. And in order for communism to work, you would have to somehow copy paste the attitude we have towards families, towards strangers. That's a very difficult thing to do. In the constrained vision, this would be dismissed out of hand as impossible, right? We'd say, actually, it's not in the cards for all of us to become, like Jesus or Mother Teresa. It's actually just it's literally not possible for most of us for biological reasons. And if you try to premise a society on the assumption that we can become that way, what you get is a totally dysfunctional system with a terrible incentive structure where, in fact, as a matter of fact, everyone is behaving in a self-interested way, and it creates all of these perversions. The capitalist system says the opposite. It says that we will never eradicate self-interest. People are always going to want more and more and more for themselves in particular, and not for others. Most people will never be able to extend true selflessness outside of their own kin network to truly sacrifice for others that they're not related to. This is true for most similar animal species as well. And so we have to create a system that aligns their incentives so that they can climb the ladder of personal status and success by creating things that other people want to buy. And in doing so, it leverages personal ambition and self-interest in a way that generally helps others as well. Sowell also gives the example of the separation of powers. So for instance, if you have the constrained vision, it makes sense. It could make sense to give one person a ton of power in the government, or give a group of people a ton of power, because we'll be able to choose the right person through proper education of the populace. We'll be able to create leaders that are truly selfless and wise, because again, human nature can be made that way. And we can reliably create and choose the right people to lead society. And so it makes sense to give them power so they can actually do things. They can actually improve society. In the constrained vision, you assume basically that everyone's knowledge is limited, aka everyone's kind of stupid or only really knows what's true in their immediate surrounding. You assume every leader is going to be self-interested and try to become king. And so you create three branches of government with separate powers that are always checking each other, so that no one of them can ever predominate. And you create a feedback mechanism, aka elections, such that, similar to capitalism, it's in the leader's self-interest to, at minimum, not do things that wildly piss off more than half of the people. So you align self-interest with the public interest. You take, but in doing that, you have to take some level of self-interest for granted as a given that will never change. So Sowell, it's no secret that Sowell is on the constrained vision, the tragic vision. That's his vision. I think in a lot of ways it's my own, and it's an important idea to grapple with, because many of us, I think, are born with utopian assumptions about what can happen. I think part of it is the fact that we're raised in families and we don't totally get why the world can't be a little more like that. And it would be very nice if it could be done. So there's a natural optimism to the utopian vision that I think attracts a lot of people. And so Sowell basically tries to pour a lot of cold water on that optimism, because if you don't, you know, the road to hell, as they say, is paved with good intentions. So that's a little bit from the conflict of visions. I'm curious what you guys find interesting about that thesis, and what you're eager to talk about.
Yeah, I mean, I just find it interesting that in order to reach these unconstrained visions and to implement them into society, you talk about the ideologies of communism. I mean, it takes basically like complete destruction or oppression of one group in order to attain something like that. Another way to put it is like the unconstrained visionists oftentimes will get rid of anything in their way for this ends. Like anything is justified. So isn't that like a really bad problem with unconstrained vision that constrained vision doesn't really seem to have?
That is a good question. So Sowell does say that in the utopian vision, the ends justify the means is quite a common attitude, because if it's possible to create a heaven on earth, then almost anything would be worth getting there. And so presumably you're talking about the various incredibly bloody communist revolutions and takeovers that have happened everywhere from Russia to Cambodia to China and so forth. I think there's something to that. However, it's also true that people quite often are attracted to the idea of the utopian vision and vote for it. Communist movements have been quite popular in other places in Latin America, and I wouldn't want to besmirch everyone with the utopian vision and say that they're all about ends justify the means, or that People with the tragic vision aren't quite often about that too. But there has been a pattern of, in particular, communists being comfortable with any level of human death in order to seize power.
I was wondering how religion factors into the constrained and unconstrained visions, because I think, at least how I was understanding it in Christianity, I feel like it views people as constrained, but because of God and Jesus, then you can become unconstrained. So I was wondering how kind of like religion changes the constrained and unconstrained views.
Yeah, that's a very interesting question, and it's one that Sowell doesn't dive too deep into. But he does say that the tragic vision values tradition more than the utopian vision. Why? The idea is something like this. If your culture that has your tradition is still around, that means it's doing something right. All kind of cultures and peoples have existed throughout history, and not all of them survive. Ergo, the ones that do must be doing something right. The tragic vision basically says that you are too stupid to pick and choose which aspects of your tradition are the ones that account for the success of your culture. So you should be very careful and think very hard before getting rid of a tradition or a cultural norm that you grow up with. That's sort of the idea behind the tragic vision. The utopian vision says that, hold on, actually we're rational animals. We're able to reason and critique the traditions that we grow up with. And it's possible that a lot of our traditions just don't make any sense, and we're just doing what we're doing because our grandparents said so and their grandparents said so. And actually, we can use our rational minds to figure out which of our traditions are key to our success and which we can actually throw away because they're causing more harm than good. And so the utopian vision has very little to no respect, essentially, for tradition, and thinks you should use reason to pick a la carte. I will say I'm a lot more sympathetic to the utopian vision on that particular issue of tradition, and your ability to get rid of certain traditions because they actually don't make sense. That said, there's also something important. The tragic vision has a good point to make there too.
So you talked about the family being kind of the ideal communism, which like has a father who kind of can like pick the kid up and like slap him or something. And so does communism like try to import the kind of because we're learning about Aristotle and the king who is above all usually gets exiled because he's so unequal that he can't be under the same rule. So is communism kind of like that, where you have the king who is so virtuous that knows what to do and then tries to not force everyone else to do that?
Yeah, totally. I mean, in the case of Joseph Stalin and Mao Zedong, you literally had a dear leader that everyone has a picture of at home and worships and believes, is taught to believe is the most wise person. And from his policies, that's the work you do. You don't get to choose your own work. You have to, the wise king has decided it would make more sense for everyone to live together on a commune, take care of each other's kids in the case of China. You're all going to farm collective land. You're not going to farm your own land. You'll farm collective land. Everything you farm will belong to the state, and the state will distribute it to you according to your needs. Now, the reason this doesn't work is because of the tragedy of the commons. If I'm a farmer and the level of work I put in has no correlation with the level of benefit that I personally see, like I could just not farm this whole year and I would be fed the same amount of grain. Me and my family would be fed the same amount of grain. What is my incentive to work other than the illusion that I can completely neglect my own self-interest and fully subordinate myself to this state project. In a family, a kid probably could do that for his parents because that's the psychology of a family. What actually happens is each farmer pursues their own narrow self-interest, understanding that it's not in their self-interest to work harder. It's in their self-interest to maybe find other black market ways of making money or use their time differently. And lo and behold, that's how you get a famine. And so, yeah, I think definitely the idea of a wise leader who's going to decide how to arrange everything has been the main fault of communism, and Sowell is very hard on that point of view.
So is the problem, sorry, just to ask one more question, is the problem that in a family the father does the work and provides, but in the communist state it's kind of like the child star, where the children are asked to provide for the family instead?
No, I think the problem is deeper than that. The problem isn't about who is doing the work. The problem is about the incentive structure of the work itself. So the reason it doesn't work isn't because the guys at the top aren't laboring. It's because both in a capitalist society and a communist society, it's the people at the bottom doing most of the labor. And in China in the 1970s, when they start opening up to capitalist marketplaces and practices in the late 70s, first you get the Xiaogang village, which basically tries this small experiment in capitalism where now it's allowing farmers to own their own plots of land. Suddenly they find that food production is doubling, tripling, quadrupling, quintupling, because each farmer now has an incentive to maximize, to get to know his own plot of land, to maximize its output for purely self-interested reasons, because he wants not only to feed his family, but to produce as much extra grain and sell on the market. He wants to get rich, period. And leveraging that purely selfish motive, all of a sudden, there's no more famine in Xiaogang village, right? And then that model then, they basically rediscovered what Adam Smith had discovered 200 years prior, and some places still haven't yet discovered, like Cuba. But it's about the incentive structure rather than who's doing the work.
It seems like the unconstrained and the constrained vision are like just two basic stories that we tell ourselves, or that we kind of assume of the world, and all our beliefs and the way we see the world is built off of that. And when I first read the book, although like I saw and I agree with what Sowell was talking about, it seemed to me that it was too limited and sometimes kind of a false dichotomy. For example, what Annalena was talking about with Christianity, that seems to be more of an unconstrained vision, when usually Christianity, if we're looking at like a two-party system or like the right and the left in America, it usually maps onto the conservatives who in like economics have a constrained vision, or in government have a constrained vision, and then their religion is unconstrained. So I was wondering if there's cases where it's like truer to take one of the visions and where it's not. Like, for example, in economics, it's truer or more accurate to take the constrained vision, but maybe in education, it's truer to take the unconstrained vision.
Mm-hmm. So yeah, your question is, can it be true that the tragic vision is better for certain domains and the utopian vision better for other domains?
Yes.
I think that's almost certainly the case. Like, there's no way that everything should be equally tragic. I think, I think economics is a situation where it's really not like the debate has been settled, and it is the tragic vision wins wherever it comes into context, into contest with the utopian vision. But you talked about education as one place in which maybe the unconstrained vision might be better. What do you mean by that?
Well, the constrained vision, I think in the first chapter talks about knowledge is kind of like a collective thing, and it's more like culture. Rather, the unconstrained vision puts more of an emphasis on reason and rationality. And we educate people because we think that, maybe their abilities are limited, but through education, they will be able to gain reason and gain skills and become better people. So we do tend to think that people will improve through education.
Right. I think what the tragic vision would say about education is that education is probably not going to make you a better person. The best it can do is teach you those core skills like how to write well, how to read well, how to do mathematics, basic shared and accepted facts of history, and drill down on those so that you can decide, you can have the skills to do whatever you're able to do in life. Whereas the utopian vision might say education can be used as a tool to fundamentally change your nature and the nature of society in ways that are desirable. So for example, we don't like unequal outcomes between men and women. We don't like the fact that probably, I don't know the number, but 90+% of CEOs of Fortune 500 companies are men. We don't like the male-female gender pay gap, the fact that men tend to earn more money. And so we're going to use education to really try to make men and women the same, for instance, right? That would be one idea. We're going to basically educate people to make sure they're not sexist, first of all, and then we're going to give boys and girls the exact same kinds of toys, and we're going to sort of push them to value the same things, and in doing so, we can actually get rid of inequality at the tail end. So that might be one way in which the two visions would differ on education, and my guess is that the latter vision would not work out very well.
Yeah, just on the point about religion, it's talking about how religious visions may ascribe omniscience and omnipotence to God, but that in itself constrains man, and so completely precludes unconstrained social vision. But I did have a question regarding like the sources he's using and the philosophy underpinning this whole thing. He does not cite Aristotle or Plato in this entire work, which is shocking to me, but he cites Hayek dozens of times. So is he just trying to explain or make sense of the modern world more so, or what is he trying to do with this book? Is it like philosophical in nature? Is it a guide to people to navigate contemporary political landscapes, or?
Yeah, I would say it's more of a guide to navigate contemporary political landscapes. My guess is he might say that the utopian vision being popular is a more recent phenomenon. I don't know to what extent societies were en masse adopting utopian assumptions in the time of Plato and Aristotle. That's actually a good question. I don't know the answer to that, but I wouldn't be surprised if the answer was a lot less than in the 20th century, say. The 20th century may be looked back on as the high watermark of wide-scale attempts to implement utopian assumptions on whole societies, including economics. Obviously, Sowell is extremely influenced by Hayek, probably more than any other single thinker. And the essay he's influenced from Hayek is called The Use of Knowledge in Society. What this essay says, Hayek's talking not about like book knowledge, he's talking about what you can call it Hayekian knowledge, which is like the knowledge that a particular deli store owner has of a particular street corner and what goes on there. You know, like the knowledge that knowledge that's local in nature, that's fleeting in nature, the kind of knowledge a businessman has about his particular corner of the market that's constantly changing, where there's no book in the library you can find to go like learn about what the I don't know, the bacon economy on 111th Street in New York is like, but the guy selling bacon knows, because he has to know. If he doesn't know, he goes out of business. He buys too much, he buys too little, he buys the wrong kind. He doesn't get enough varieties. He learns every day what the market needs and how the market is changing. That's the kind of knowledge Hayek is concerned about, and the use of knowledge in society. And Hayek makes the simple point that what the price mechanism does, the price mechanism does what would only be possible with an omniscient organizer. So if you had an omniscient organizer, he could simply say, oh, okay, people on 111th Street need more bacon today, and people downtown need more cabbage. And he could just tell everyone what to do so that everyone gets what they need and want. In the absence of that, the price mechanism actually does the same thing without anyone having to arrange it. So the example he uses is like if for whatever reason tin becomes more scarce, either because I don't know, for whatever reason there's less tin in the world, the price of tin will simply go up, and that will convey to every relevant everyone who's affected by that decision downstream will ration their use of tin as if directed by a central planner, simply because the price has gone up. And so the price mechanism coordinates behavior to use scarce resources, and it actually transmit all of that local Hayekian knowledge that millions of people have in a really efficient way. And this is that's actually the essay that really launches Sowell's interest in the tragic vision. He views the price mechanism as the perfect example of how taking on the tragic vision can actually yield better outcomes on the whole.
My biggest problem with the unconstrained and the constrained vision is that, to me, they seem very exclusive. It's either that you're unconstrained or constrained, and I just don't believe humans are like that. I think this is somewhat what Kat was getting at, is, say, with education, I wouldn't say I have neither a constrained or an unconstrained vision. I think it's a combination of the two. What would Sowell say to that?
I don't know, but I agree. It's a spectrum rather than a binary, and I think in a lot of ways, when you write, you often have to make a spectrum a binary in order to get the point across. But in reality, a lot of people are somewhere along the spectrum where they have certain tragic assumptions, certain utopian assumptions, and so I think that's a fair point.
He has a chapter about dynamic visions, and he's saying that it's not all just either you're unconstrained or constrained. He's talking about inconsistent and hybrid visions make it impossible to equate constrained and unconstrained visions simply with the political left and right. He discusses Marxism and libertarianism as things that do not exactly fit into one or the other.
When we're talking about the right and the left, recently when Trump came into office, he was just like, I mean, it's just been executive order after executive order. I mean, it hasn't changed this fast in a very, very long time, the government, that is. And he's definitely taking on an unconstrained vision, just by the fact that, the presidents kind of post-Obama have been putting forth like more executive orders. And that's sort of against the right. I mean, I don't know if Trump could be even put in the right or the left at this point. But if he can be put in the right, then he's being unconstrained. So wouldn't that kind of flip the direction of right and left?
Yeah, so what you're getting at is something libertarians have been complaining about for decades, which is that the Republican Party claims to be, or I don't think it claims to be anymore, but it used to claim to be the party of small government, which is essentially libertarian in principle, and jibes very well with the tragic vision. The idea of the tragic vision is we all have Hayekian knowledge of our own personal lives and our own corners of the market and corners of society. And as a result, it makes more sense for us to have power over our decisions rather than a central authority. If that's true, then you would want smaller government in general. But, for the past several decades, it hasn't mattered whether a Republican's in office or a Democrat's in office. The presidency has assumed more and more power. Government in general has assumed more and more power. The budget has increased pretty much every single year since at least the 90s. And executive orders, Obama had tons of executive orders. Trump has tons of executive orders now. So there really is no party that reflects the assumptions of the tragic vision through and through, although you do get Republicans sometimes claiming to represent that party. I think it's possible tariffs are another example, right? Like the idea is the government can intervene in order to arrange the economy in a desirable direction to bring back manufacturing jobs that haven't been in America for many, many decades at this point. Yeah, this is a classic example of the unconstrained vision, because the idea is by intervening in the economy and arranging things just so, the government can essentially create better outcomes than the free market would create by itself. But of course, this means that now steel is going to be artificially, the price of steel is going to be artificially inflated, which hurts everyone that uses steel to produce anything else. And so forth. And what's more, people will now come to the president hat in hand looking for exceptions to the tariffs, which, again, because everyone is going to pursue their own self-interest, right? Everyone is going to try to get exempted from the tariff if it doesn't benefit them. This is, I think, why you want to be careful and not just equate tragic and utopian to right and left. They're visions that are independent of our current, of today's politics. And you don't just want to make it into a synonym for Republican versus Democrat.
So there's a great book called White Lies by A.J. Boehm. I don't know if you've heard of it before, but it talks about the internal infrastructure of the NAACP and his tension with Du Bois. But what I was wondering is it clear that Sowell's political thought had any impact with regards to whether it's the life of Walter White or specifically the civil rights movement?
Oh, yeah, certainly. So Sowell was born around, I want to say, 1933. So he's going on 92 now. He was an adult during the civil rights movement, and when he like all black people, he was happy that he could now go to any restaurant in the South and be served and not have to sit on the back of a bus and so forth. But he questioned the automatic assumption that socioeconomic progress and equality would flow from political rights. So basically, a lot of people assumed in the 60s, okay, now that black people can vote, a few years from now, black people will have the same income and wealth as white people. But Sowell said, why would anyone assume that? Why would anyone assume that political rights, which are valuable on their own, would automatically lead to socioeconomic equality of outcome? And later in his career, he would point out that actually African Americans made lots of progress between, say, 1940 and 1960. The poverty rate cut in half in the black community from like 80% to 40%, all before the civil rights movement, mostly as a result of migrating from the South to the North to higher paying jobs and so forth. And so how this connects with the tragic and utopian vision is that the question is, are equal outcomes to be expected in a fair society, or are unequal outcomes to be expected in a society with very different groups of people and different cultures. And the conclusion Sowell comes to is that even if society were perfectly fair, which of course it isn't, you would still expect two people with different histories, different cultures, different demographics, different values to perform differently across a whole range of metrics. And so if equal outcomes are not actually on the menu, then you begin to look at how the policies that are trying to enforce equal outcomes have distorting and toxic side effects potentially, right? So that's, whereas if equal outcomes are to be expected, then it's a matter of educating people out of their racism, social programs to help people, and the measure of whether you're failing is the measure of whether there's an outcome gap. So you can basically diagnose a society's racism by the gap, by the income gap and the wealth gap between groups. Of course, if inequality is to be expected, then you actually don't know why there's an inequality. It could be discrimination, but it could also be cultural differences. Cool. All right.